Welcome to the first of 7 videos from the Roman Army lecture on social origins and the recruitment process in the Roman military. Okay, in this first video, I'll get rid of my face. I'm going to be talking about social origins. Okay, especially during the imperial period. So let's get going. All right, so in this particular case, I am looking at the approximate social origins while Polion, Aurelius Polion, one of the 3 main characters with the story of the Roman military, was alive. Okay, he was a soldier again of the Legio Second Audiutrix from Pannonia Inferior, and his name might be down to the extension of citizenship. Now, the 2 main bodies of troops that I will focus this little video on are the legions and the auxiliaries. Had a long history, and as I say, we're going to come back to this. The legions are the citizen soldiers of the Roman army, and a legion is 1 unit. Auxiliaries are allied soldiers of the Romans with a long history, often non-Romans, not always. And there are wings, ally, and cohortes, the units. Okay. Now, in order to be a legionary soldier, not legionnaire, which is for the French and other more recent militaries. In order to be a legionary, you had to be a Roman citizen. For the most part, you couldn't be a slave, a freedman, or a foreigner, something that we will come back to as well. To understand the recruitment of legionaries, their origins during the imperial, especially Principate period, so Augustus to the 3rd century CE, the bulk of our evidence comes from inscriptions. And I've said we have thousands, many thousands of these, and many of these have to do with soldiers. They say a bit about maybe where they're from and what they did in their careers. All sorts of different soldiers get listed. Obviously, if you have more money, you can more likely to be able to pay for a more elaborate inscription, and so you do tend to get slightly more soldiers from high-ranking ranks, but it is what it is. Of the types that we find are like the highest ranking centurions, the primipili, the centurions in general, but we also get some ordinary legionaries. One of the main sources for this information is Jan Le Bohec's wonderful book, The Imperial Roman Army, which is a translation from a French book. Okay, so the process that we find, and we focus on officers, non-commissioned officers. These are centurions. These are ones who moved up the ranks from a lowly recruit, and that's about as high as they can go. In the 1st century, most of these officers were Italians. By the time we get to the middle of the 2nd century, there are more provincials serving, people from Gaul, more or less modern-day France, and a few other parts, and Italy. And then when we get to late 2nd, early 3rd century CE, so this is really when Polion was alive, a lot of them, much like him, are from western provinces along the Danube, and there's still some Italians. As far as regular legionaries, so these are not centurions, in the period from Augustus to Vespasian, so roughly 27 BCE to 69 CE. There are a lot of Italians, though we also find some Romanized provincials, again from Gaul and some other places. As we shift from Vespasian, the Flavians, to the middle of the 2nd century, the period of the 5 good emperors, we find Romanized provincials from places like Narbonese, Gaul, Baetica in Spain, Africa, Macedonia over in the east, Italy, and depending on the context, the province of deployment. Then when we get to the last bit of this chunk, from Antoninus Pius to Severus Alexander, so right before at the cusp of the 3rd century crisis, we get soldiers from Romanized western provinces, again the Danube especially. Think of Aurelius Polion. And many of them come from around the camp, so the origins are presented as origo castris. Okay, something else we can come back to later. Now, as far as the auxiliaries go, so they are, for the most part, slightly lower status than legionaries, for a variety of means, pay slightly less, etc. So their evidence comes from inscriptions too. But many of this comes from diplomas, which I talked about in terms of sources. These are sort of like little passports which provide us with a fantastic wealth of information. Now, there aren't specific rules, and there is, in fact, a lot of regional variation. In the 1st century, recruitment looked a bit like this, as far as we know. So about nearly 4/5 of them came from Europe, and of those, Nearly 56% came from Western Europe, 15% from Asia, 6.5% from Africa. Auxiliaries seem more or less to have been more likely to be sent abroad than legionaries, and there are a couple of revolts that came up out of this. And it does seem that in some situations, people were targeted because of their specific skills. There's some debate about this, but at least at some stages, this seems to have been a thing. Okay, as far as their social status go, and I'll come back to this, the last point for this video. Overall, soldiers tend to be seen slightly lower in our sources. It continues most of the 1st, 2nd century. And it's not surprising this applies to auxiliaries, many of whom were foreigners or non-Romans, peregrini. So they weren't eligible to serve as legions, but they could be auxiliaries. If there were Roman citizens, they tend to be cavalry. Although this pattern, at least according to Le Bohec, shifts a bit. From Vespasian, we start to see more and more citizens enlisting. From Hadrian to Marcus Aurelius, it's maybe about half and half. And then, so he argues, from Marcus to Severus Alexander, they're mostly citizens. Okay, so that's just one body of evidence used to look at the origins of legionaries and auxiliaries during the first 2 to 3 centuries CE. And it gives you some sense of how things changed during the Principate or the early to high imperial period. So ends the first video.